Hello and welcome to Greenbytes Wednesdays. Greenbytes Wednesdays is a podcast series where we facilitate critical conversations and steer consciousness when it comes to understanding the impact of our digital footprint across Nigeria's technology ecosystem. We hope that with this advanced knowledge, we can introduce you to some tools, trends, and best practices that can enhance your knowledge about digital sustainability. Are you curious about climate change? Are you a tech enthusiast or a climate entrepreneur? Come on board and learn on this episode as we get on whichever conversation of the Greenbytes Wednesday podcast series. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Area I under the Scale Initiative, funded by the UK government through the Digital Access Program. My name is Seyifunmi Adebote and I am glad to be your host. Welcome on board. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Greenbytes Wednesday. Such a privilege to have you joining us today. On Greenbytes Wednesday, it's a series of podcasts where we have critical conversations. And here we try to reflect on things that matter when it comes to digital footprints in Nigeria, technology ecosystem, and how we can advance knowledge, trends, tools, all that has to do with digital sustainability. So if you're thinking of that platform where you can learn about digital sustainability, energy, maybe look at it on a broader scope of climate issues, then this is the right place to learn all of that from. Greenbytes Wednesday, we have these episodes coming to you every Wednesday. So feel free to check it out everywhere you find your podcast, on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or any other podcast streaming platform. My name is Seyifunmi Adebote, and Greenbytes Wednesday is a part of Scale for Net Zero program. Scale here is smart climate awareness, learning, and empowerment. And we're very grateful to the UK government for funds and resources to make this possible. Welcome to this episode of Greenbytes Wednesdays. When it comes to carbon neutrality, not many people know what it is. I myself, it took quite a while for me to understand what exactly carbon neutrality is. And if you're in the space, you know that there's a lot of lingo that we throw all over the place. Today is net zero, tomorrow is NDCs, tomorrow is NAPs, UNFCCCs, or terminologies like adaptation, mitigation. And sometimes you're just very confused. What exactly is what? And that's pretty much why we have conversations like this, to see that we can simplify these terminologies, these issues, and to make it clear to you, the listener, or you watching, what role you can play in all of this. Today, the focus is going to be on carbon neutrality. What is that? What does it mean? But particularly, we would move towards the aspect of research in carbon neutrality. Where are we, particularly here in Nigeria, where we're speaking from? What sort of advances do we need to make when it comes to making sense of our place in this conversation? My guest today is David Raymond Edet. He's a consultant and energy expert with experience across various sectors, including the energy, infrastructure, governance, and communications. It looks like we're in an all-white party, but we're just going to be having conversation. Welcome, David. It's nice to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
And I know you've been consulting for organizations globally and helping them to sort of optimize their operations when it comes to market reach. But if we could maybe sort of start from a very basic level, in your work, how does it connect, or how do you help your clients or people that you work with to sort of understand issues around digital sustainability? Let's start with that from the basics.
Thank you very much once again for having me, Shay. One of the things that I always say when I start speaking with clients at first is, if you look at how the world has transitioned right from these stone ages up until where we are today, which is, you might want to call it the AI, the age of the AI, the age of the machines. You definitely cannot downplay or ignore the impact of the digital ecosystem in any organization, to start with. And then, if you permit me to jump the gun and even drive it down to what we're talking about, carbon neutrality and the energy sector, which is where I really, play a lot of where I play a lot. You need to develop technologies to meet the ever evolving needs of human beings. All right. Now we're talking about climate change. We're talking about energy transition. So everyone is talking about it. And then Africans are saying, okay, we want to transit, we want to move to more sustainable sources of energy. However, we don't even have access to the basic sources of energy. And you're not going to get that access. You're not going to be able to even meet those transition goals if you do not have your digital systems properly set up.
Great. So now let's sort of narrow down to the theme of this conversation: carbon neutrality. I am very familiar with the term net zero, for example, or carbon trading. And when I try to sort of delve into carbon neutrality, I really couldn't see so much difference with the more popular term net zero, because basically it's about when the amount of carbon dioxide that is emitted into the atmosphere is more or less equal with the amount that is being absorbed. And then you have like a net zero carbon footprint. So would you say that it is different when we say carbon neutrality? Is it the same thing with net zero? Is it just the syntax or the grammar?
And obviously then in our field, you have a lot of these things crossing paths and intersecting. But then when you're talking about carbon neutrality, like you've said, the real goal is you want to balance how much you're emitting with how much you're capturing. And when you have that balance across board, so when you have that balance globally, and then you realize that you get to fix the problem that we are facing today, which is the climate change challenge. And then for the net zero part, you have countries like Nigeria, and of course a lot of the countries from the western part of the world committing to actually completely taking away their carbon footprints.
Yeah.
And so when you look at these two things, they are somewhat similar.
So are they the same?
They are
not net zero carbon neutrality. Are they the same?
They are not the same.
So what's the striking difference?
The striking difference is that net zero aims for we're completely dissolving. It's like we're not dealing with carbons.
Okay.
We're not emitting. Some emissions are down to zero. However, when you're looking at the neutrality, looking at the balance of things, we're not saying, oh, it's going to be a zero, emission game here. It's like we're just having to find that balance.
Okay, great. And like you said, many of these things intersect. I've seen spaces where they sort of argue that net zero is like, yeah, we let some go and then we'll let some come down. And I mean, every day we learn. So it's really, I think what is most important is to know that they intersect and to also understand for ourselves this different terminology, what they mean and how they sort of relates to us. But let's narrow it down to projection, timeline. Different parts of the world have different projections when it comes to achieving this carbon neutrality or sort of a net zero, or sort of ensuring that we don't have as much emissions that is leading to climate change. I know in Europe, there is a timeline around 2050. Some countries are very forthright and thinking 2045. In Nigeria, it's around 2060. In other parts, they don't even have a timeline. They just like, we go with the flow. If you had to put a timeline, how practically do you think that we should be aiming for a particular time when it comes to achieving this sort of equaling our emissions and our absorption of carbon?
So this question is very interesting and very, very dear to me, because one of the issues we've been dealing with in recent times, and it's a question of how fast should you transition? How quickly should you transition? You have people bringing up phrases like a just energy transition. And so at the base of this question is, what would one person call a just energy transition? Recall I started by saying in Africa, we haven't even been able to meet our basic energy needs. You have a larger percentage of the population in Africa without access to electricity.
Yeah.
Right? And so before you start putting timelines to transitioning to net zero or to more sustainable sources of energy, we have to put a timeline to how quickly we can meet our own energy needs. A lot of experts think that the 2060 timeline is not feasible for us.
And for us, do you say it's Nigeria?
For Nigeria, and I guess you would say Africa as a whole.
Okay.
Right. So let's speak Africa as a continent in this case. However, there's a lot of technologies that have been developed, both by private entities and by, I think I would say, government-backed entities. So, for example, the NNPC here in Nigeria. And they have looked at areas of developing carbon capture technologies, right, such as the direct air capture. And what these things would do for us, it helps us to propel the speed at which we can say, okay, look, we can meet XYZ targets. But if it's in terms of how quickly our timeline should be for transitioning, I would say let's look at the timeline for even meeting our basic energy needs, which probably is the next 42. Let's say 40 years.
Okay, great. And I think one thing that is really, really necessary for us to get there is research. Right now, we must admit we don't have so much data when it comes to Nigeria's digital emissions, when it comes to our footprint or what is being done. It's also very sketchy to measure how much we're emitting, what mechanisms are in place to see that we balance off the absorption. So now that we've set the basis, we've sort of, have a very clear understanding of what carbon neutrality is and how it's being used. I think the question that I would ask you here is, what are some of the most effective carbon capture and storage technology that are currently being researched in Nigeria, for example? And maybe thereafter we can delve into what's the potential for these, especially in the industrial sector.
Okay, so like I was saying earlier, so you have a few key carbon capture technologies. So you have the carbon capture and storage technology.
Okay.
You have the carbon DSC, which is the direct air capture technology. And so the DSC deals with capturing it from the atmosphere. So you're using whether it's filters or chemicals to capture the carbon from the atmosphere. And then the carbon capture and storage is you don't even let it get out from the processing plants. And so you capture the carbons before they even get into the atmosphere. Okay. And then you have the carbon capture utilization, which involves, so when you capture these things, and again, these emissions are not just waste. They can be utilized into energy and fuels. And so that's what the carbon capture utilization technology entails. And like I said earlier, you have a few and very key entities already utilizing these technologies. Although,
Nigeria?
Yes, in Nigeria. Although I would say we have two major issues, and I'll still mention the agency. I mentioned Mobile, NNPC, and there's a more private one, Pana Holdings.
Okay.
Pana Holdings is owned by the very intellectual Daria Akobo. And I know that they have been showcasing a lot of their technologies. But then you see the issue that we're facing is the problem of scaling, one. Two, like you've said, the problem of getting right data. And then, of course, you have the security challenges and then the political side of it.
Okay. So apart from these problems, do you think that any of these things are also copy and pasted? Or would you say that they were very from the scratch, researched in Nigeria, put into the context of Nigeria, made to work?
I wouldn't use the word copy and pasted, but I would say that these technologies are not indigenous to us.
Okay.
Which, of course, would give an issue of adaptation, or in the case where you have a company exit the country, they're going with their staff. They're going with their expatriates which they brought in. And more often than not, the skills may not have been fully passed down or even passed down at all. And so you have a situation where the skills have not been passed down. There's a gap in implementing these technologies. So I wouldn't say it's copy and paste. I would say because they were not fully developed by us, for us, the whole play.
So do you think that to develop this further, there is a place for research, like a local driven research?
110%. And as a matter of fact, the African Petroleum Producers Organization, APU, under the leadership of the Secretary General, Dr. Omar Farouk Ibrahim, has heavily pushed for this. And there is a research division. It's part of the things is we need to push for more training institutes, as well as petroleum training institutes, general energy training institutes across the continent. And what that should do is also to drive knowledge sharing. And so Nigeria should be able to share its knowledge with Angola with Mozambique, and so on and so forth. And by the time we come together under one umbrella, it's like what's already happening, then you realize that, of course, 2 heads are better than 1, 3 heads are better than 2. And then you keep multiplying from there.
Okay, great. So I wonder if we could piggyback a little to the first question that I asked, which was around technologies that have been researched in Nigeria to achieve carbon capture. And I say this because I understand that our conversation has mostly tilted towards the oil and gas and the power sector.
Yeah.
But if you look at the indices, the 7 of them, we have other sectors like agriforestry and land use, we have waste, we have water, we have transportation sector. So do you also have thoughts? And agriforestry and land use, for example, is also a very big sector when it comes to emissions. So do you have any thoughts or ideas around technologies in these other sectors, or sort of research that has been going on in these other sectors?
So because I'm an oil man, I would say, right. But then the advantage of the work I do, which is to consult for organizations, is to have access to a lot of other fields.
Okay.
And I would still drive it home to the oil and gas question, because we pick agriculture, for example. You have the machines, and the machines are being driven by fuel, and the fuel is the diesel or the PMS, and then you have the smoke in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Or whether it's the machines in the factory. And so you now get to start asking questions or talking about things like wind, solar energy. So ultimately, I think everything is connected. As if you're talking about reducing emissions, you would still go back to the basic question of energy provision. Transportation, for example. And we see in our country, in Nigeria today, we are really, really pushing, the government is really pushing for transitioning to CNG. And you have the transport system, the buses are CNG buses, which obviously emits less than the PMS vehicles.
Yeah.
And so all these things would still most likely drive us back to the question of your oil and gas resource.
I see.
And then how do you transition other technologies away from XYZ resource?
I see. Absolutely, I agree with you on that. But just thinking further a bit, if you also are familiar with the conversations around emissions itself, in the agricultural sector, there is the notion that methane, for example, is more, deadly, or is sort of contributes more in terms of emissions. And I'm wondering if there could be some sort of capture mechanisms around methane gases and how it's being used, and sort of building up on it to see that it is used rather than emitted.
I believe the agricultural technology, you leave that for the agric experience, have best answer to that.
Lovely, thanks. And of course, we cannot know it all, and that's why we have various experts, people from diverse field, come on this podcast on Greenbytes Wednesday to have conversations around these various issues. Thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for listening. We hope you're learning and that you will be very inspired to share with people in your network, and also to check out other episodes. This is Greenbytes Wednesday, and I'm having conversation with David Raymond Edet. We've been speaking about advances in research when it comes to carbon neutrality. First, we started with simplifying what is carbon neutrality, and we've gotten into the nitty-gritty of the theme of carbon neutrality. So I'll turn back to you, David, here. What would you say is the myth when it comes to understanding maybe not carbon neutrality specifically, but people engaging with these issues of sustainability?
It will always be basic energy. It will always be basic energy. And I like to look at things from ground up, right? So let's take any country in Africa, for instance, and look at it from ground up.
Okay.
And let's take Nigeria. Let's take my hometown, Akwa Ibom. You go back to Akwa Ibom State, you go to the very, very rural areas in the villages, and the typical Nigerian or African, all the way down there in this small cubicle, wants to have access to his firewood. One. Two, he wants to have access to his power, to power his bulb, his radio, his fan, etc. He won't think of solar energy or wind energy while he's still trying to find his firewood, or his kerosene to power his lantern. And so, of course, to them, these things they become secondary thoughts. What one would call first world problems, which is the truth, because they have third world problems they need to solve. You look at challenges like moving from point A to point B in your vehicle, or having to buy an electric vehicle, the cost of importation, and so all these other things become what you would call luxury goods for even those of us here in the urban area. So
absolutely, and most times when you ask, people from the developed country, quote unquote, or the Westerners, to say climate change is a problem, what can we do? And they tell you, oh, stop eating meat, and you think, well, I haven't even secured my dinner, but you have food for the next 3 months. Or they tell you turn off the light, and you're like, well, this light only comes up 2 hours in a day, but you have it for 24 hours, and you can think of these things as luxury. Or they tell you walk more instead of driving, but you're like, well, I wish I had a car in the first place to ride.
and I wish the roads were safe enough to walk on. It's so many different things that make this a secondary problem to Africans, even though, of course, not neglecting the fact that it is a real problem globally, just that the typical African person, rightfully so.
Absolutely. So as we coast this home, we cannot say that despite our peculiarity or sort of putting into focus where we are as a people, we cannot take away the fact that we still emit, and that there are ways to approach our emissions and to be more sustainable in our daily life. So we'll look into that, what it means. Probably David has some recommendations for us regarding what can an average Nigerian who is not, emitting so much, what can such individual do to become or to reflect as more sustainable?
First of all, we have to push for a certain mindset, and that is that two truths can coexist, which is, one, the need for survival, and two, the threat of survival. So the need for survival being our energy needs, and the threat of survival being climate change, obviously, right? So in as much as we can say, oh yes, we're only contributing 2% globally, but then the threat is still real. We can only get to a long-term solution if we work together. And of course, these two things can exist in harmony. There are very, very basic things that we can implement as Africans from the smallest level, which I would say, for example, solar-powered communities. And this is for rural communities. And that's because they definitely do not take as much energy they don't consume as much energy as the urban cities do.
Or the industrials.
Or the industrial areas. And secondly, we have land. We have land mass in Africa. And we're very blessed to be situated globally in a region where you have a lot of sun coming at us. So, of course, you have a lot of solar blessings, if I might call it that, right? So that's one area which we can implement. The government in Nigeria is already implementing the CNG buses, which I think is a very amazing initiative. You just have to get it right. And you did say something, encourage walking. Encourage mass transports. Make the trains work, and make them secure and safe. Let the buses be comfortable for people. And then you'd reduce the cars on the streets. We also may need to push for technologies like, what kind of machines do you use in your house? What kind of bulbs do you use in your house? using energy efficient bulbs? Is the government subsidizing the prices of these things? What's the tax rates for these things? Because this is what bring prices down. Then we now start looking at the economics of all these other things. Are we going to subsidize or reduce the taxation rates for cars that, you say, for example, as electric vehicles? So when we start looking at all of these things from the government perspective, then it also motivates the citizens to say, hey, look, it's more affordable for me to do X as opposed to doing Y. I'll give you an instance. It's definitely, I would say, in the long run, better to have your solar powered inverter batteries as opposed to running your diesel generators or your petrol generators.
If you can afford the first.
If you can afford the initial, right?
Yes.
So now the question is, how do we bring that initial investment down? And then you bring your economist onto the show to analyze all of that. Because in the long run, you're asking how much are you buying your diesel or your PMS, how much are you servicing your generators, the wear and tear, the noise pollution, so those other factors.
Okay, great. As we coast home and we sort of bring the conversation to a close, I cannot take away the fact that policy plays a very central role in all of this. But for policies to be effective, what roles do research play, such that how does research feed into policies in ways that helps promote carbon neutrality, and both at local level, state level, that is, or at national level when we look at countrywide?
The reason why I'm passionate about this question is because I personally believe that either as a country, as a continent, or globally, we have fallen off. And what I mean by that is a lot of the work that governments used to take into consideration, or even private entities, are research papers that were done by professors in the school or faculties in universities. That's not the case today. A lot of the work that the universities do now, a lot of research paper is just
Lying on the shelf, gathering done.
And let's bring it down to the facts and the realities of our country. I finished university. I did my project work. I'm not sure what I used it for afterwards. It was a very revolutionary work on what's it called, networking.
Okay.
Right. And then right after that, you're done. You're counting how many more people that happens to you. The universities no longer do research papers. So we need to get back to the basics. You have to encourage universities to say, oh, this faculty come up with XYZ solutions. And the government at the state level should be able to listen to these people. The House of Assembly should be able to call a faculty in the university of the state to say, come and present, a House Committee on Power, for example.
Yeah.
Or we want to commission XYZ university faculty to come up with some solutions. How do we mitigate this or that? And so the government needs to work in unison, both the government, the universities, the private sector. And of course, if the government works with universities, creates the enabling environment, the private sector will invest. These guys want to invest their money, but they want their money to be safe. So it's just, how do you assure me that I'm going to, first of all, get ROI? In fact, how do you assure me that my money will not disappear, first of all, before we start talking about ROIs? And so I think if we go back to that basic and look at how, the government can look inwards and say, come, give us the research papers. To look at institutions like Apple, GCF, African Union, and say, have you guys commissioned people to do studies? How do we implement these studies that have been commissioned by these organizations? And then use that to create the enabling business environment for whether it's the foreign investors or even the local investors.
I see.
So that's what I think. Sorry if I might add, in Nigeria, you have NCDMB doing something. What does that mean? NCDMB is the Nigerian Content Monitoring Board. So they push for, and Development Board. So they push for local content. And NCDMB has gone so far to do that within Nigeria and outside Nigeria, so even within Africa. Okay. And so the whole idea is we need to develop local content. Back to the technologies we spoke about earlier. If you say XYZ University, XYZ group of individuals have a novel idea on carbon capture technologies, right now I can tell you, you should write it to NCDMB. They're willing to say, okay, come, how can we support you to develop this? And so you need to create that awareness. People need to know about the fact that yes, we blame the government for a lot of things.
Yeah.
But there are lots of agencies, international government agencies and international government bodies, and also even the national government, who are willing to fund projects that one might consider futuristic, if I may use that word.
Great.
So yes.
Yeah. So the last question I ask is around collaboration, and you mentioned different entities. You talked about the financial sector, the academic sector. You talk about government, and I know that there's like looking at some statistics recently, the Nigerian Environmental Study Action Team, NEST as we popularly call them, they sort of put out implementation strategies to help Nigeria achieve at least 30% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. Now, that's a strategic document. How it will be used, we don't know. If we move to the academic part of things, also, the University of Lagos have research papers that clearly shows how we can reduce the potentials of bioenergy and how we can reduce agricultural waste, convert them into biofuel, and see that we can have at least 30% of our greenhouse gases emission reduced, same by 2030. Lastly, is also an academic group at the Abuja Ahmadu Bello University that has sort of list of technologies that could be useful and could help Nigeria achieve as much as 40% of carbon emission reduced in the industrial sector by 2030. But like I said, these are some research that has been made by different entities. Now, how do we sort of weave all of this together? This brings us to the last question I want to ask you. The role of collaboration is important, needless to ask, but how can we strengthen these collaborations?
I think I'll start by saying, so one thing I've noticed about, and I'll say for Nigeria as a country, is we are very good at solving problems that are external to us. And I'll
Like you solve other people's problems?
No. So problems that come from outside. So I'll pick since let's go to the health sector. Let's pick Ebola virus, or even when COVID happened. We are very good at uniting and actually sticking to certain rules to solve problems that are external to us. However, we have a lot of internal problems, and that we've not found the solution to.
Like malaria, Nigeria has about 30%
Exactly.
of the share.
So that's we've not found the solutions to. And that's largely comes from the, should I say, abundance mindset. So we have an abundance mindset in Nigeria, which is why I say Nigerians are tough. You can be going through the worst things and we find a way to joke about it because everything will be all right in the end of the day, right? However, it's the same thing we've been saying from the start. Definitely think that leaders should work with private entities, work with the researchers to implement the research that has actually been done. The system, the agencies across Africa that have been tasked with implementing certain reports need to sit up. There needs to be some sort of benchmark that we're judging or basically we're judging these agencies on. So we're saying you need to reach a certain percentage by XYZ, or otherwise this and that. So those strict measures need to be put in place. And this is just my own thought. The leaders need to be held accountable, the agencies need to be held accountable, the organizations need to be held accountable, and the people need to be made aware of the advantages of these eventual collaborations, so that when you come to things, at the local level, you can actually be willing to accept whatever change comes with it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much indeed, David Edet.
Thank you very much.
It's a very good place to call it a wrap. We've been speaking about the role of research when it comes to advancing carbon neutrality. Nigeria, over 200 million people, quite diverse when it comes to our emissions. 7 sectors, if you look at it, that we emit from. And the big question remains, how soon do we get to net zero? 2030, 2040, 2050, or 2060, as we currently have, or are we going to shift the goalpost? And David very clearly brings this conversation to a wrap, where he talks about the role of collaboration. And I do hope that you, regardless of which space you find yourself, you can very clearly see where you fit into the big puzzle, and you will begin to take action. That's the size of this episode. It's been Greenbytes Wednesday, and it's such a privilege to have been the host. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks to the team, Ayo Ajibola, the producer extraordinaire, wonderful, to Kim and everyone who's been in the studio today. Thank you very much indeed. Lastly, I want to say thanks to the UK government for funding this and making it possible for us to bring dozens of these episodes to sort of spotlight on digital sustainability, an aspect that not many people are looking at. Till the next episode, my name is Seyifunmi Adebote, and keep doing all you can to make the world a better place. Bye for now. Thank you very much for joining us on this episode of Greenbytes Wednesday. This podcast is brought to you by Area I under the Scale Initiative, thanks to funding from the UK government through the Digital Access Program. Have you learned something new? Please share with your network, share with your friends, as I look forward to hosting you on yet another episode of Greenbytes Wednesday next week. Follow us on our social media platforms, check out our courses, test yourself, see how much you know, how much you're learning when it comes to digital and sustainability ecosystem in Nigeria. And I should remind you that as you balance your knowledge of digital ecosystem, also remember to stay committed to a shared and sustainable planet. My name is Seyifunmi Adebote. Bye for now.